The evening air carried a chill as Walter Jenkins pushed open the heavy wooden door of Mac's Tavern. The familiar smell of beer and the gentle hum of country music welcomed him like an old friend. At 90 years old, Walter moved slowly but with purpose, his worn leather shoes making a soft tapping sound against the wooden floor. "Evening, Walt," called Tom, the bartender, his round face breaking into a smile. "The usual?" Walter nodded and made his way to his corner table. It was Tuesday evening, and for the past 15 years, Tuesday evenings belonged to Walter at Mac's. The small corner table, slightly hidden from the main crowd but with a clear view of the entrance, was where he would sit for exactly 2 hours, nursing a single whiskey neat while looking through old photographs he kept in a small tin box. Tonight, Walter had brought a particular set of photos, ones he rarely looked at. Black and white images of young men in military uniforms standing arm in arm, their faces a mixture of pride and fear. Walter ran his thumb over one photo, clearing a smudge from the face of a young man with a crooked smile. "Here you go, Walt," Tom said, placing the whiskey on the table. "On the house tonight." "Nonsense," Walter replied, reaching for his wallet. "Never took charity before, not starting now." Tom shrugged but knew better than to argue. Walter had been coming to the tavern longer than Tom had owned it, and the old man's stubborn pride was as much a fixture as the deer head mounted above the bar. Walter paid and took a small sip of his drink, feeling the familiar burn travel down his throat. The tavern was quieter than usual. A couple of regulars sat at the bar watching a baseball game, and a group of office workers occupied a table near the jukebox. Walter preferred it this way, quiet enough to hear his own thoughts but not so empty that his memories grew too loud. The door to Mac's swung open with force, letting in a gust of cold air and the rumble of motorcycle engines from outside. 3 men walked in, their heavy boots thumping against the floor. They wore leather jackets with patches Walter couldn't quite make out, but their presence immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. They were loud, laughing and cursing as they made their way to the bar. The tallest of the 3, a bald man with a thick beard, ordered beers for the group. Walter watched them from his corner, noticing how the office workers seemed to huddle closer together, their voices dropping to whispers. Tom served the bikers quickly, his usual friendly demeanor replaced with cautious efficiency. Walter returned to his photographs, trying to tune out the increasingly loud conversation from the bar. But it wasn't long before he sensed someone standing over his table. Looking up, he found himself staring at the belt buckle of the tall biker. "Hey there, Grandpa," the man said, his voice carrying a slight slur. "This is where we like to sit." Walter looked past him to see the other 2 bikers approaching, both carrying their beers. One was younger, maybe in his late 20s, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. The other was heavy-set with a ruddy face and a patchy beard. "Plenty of other tables available," Walter replied calmly, taking another small sip of his whiskey. The tall biker laughed, looking back at his friends. "You hear that? Grandpa says there are other tables." He turned back to Walter, leaning down so their faces were closer. "But we want this one. It's got the best view." Walter could smell beer and cigarettes on the man's breath. He'd faced worse intimidation in his life, much worse, but he also knew that at 90 his fighting days were long behind him. "I'll be done in about an hour," Walter said, maintaining eye contact. "Table's all yours after that." The younger biker snickered. "An hour? What's so special about this table anyway? What are you looking at, old man?" He reached for one of Walter's photographs, but Walter was surprisingly quick for his age, sliding the photos back into the tin box. "Those aren't for sharing," Walter said, his voice taking on an edge that made the young biker pause. The 3rd biker, the heavy-set one, dropped heavily into the chair across from Walter. "Come on, guys. Let's join Grandpa. Maybe he'll tell us war stories." He laughed loudly at his own joke. By now the tavern had grown uncomfortably quiet. The baseball game still played on the television, but no one was watching it anymore. All eyes were on the corner table, where 3 large bikers had surrounded a frail-looking old man. Tom approached cautiously. "Gentlemen, there are plenty of open tables. Why don't I set you up with a round on the house?" "We're fine right where we are," the tall biker said without looking at Tom. "Grandpa here was just about to share his photo album with us." Walter kept his face neutral, but his mind was racing. Not with fear, he'd long ago made peace with his mortality, but with calculation. He'd been in worse situations with worse odds. What's your name, old-timer? The tall biker asked, pulling up a chair so close that his knee bumped against Walter's. Walter Jenkins, he replied simply. Well, Walter Jenkins, I'm Jack, but everyone calls me Razor. He gestured to the young biker. That's Dog, then to the heavyset one. And that's Truck, and we're the Road Demons. Walter nodded, unimpressed. Nice to meet you. Razor's face twitched with annoyance at Walter's calm demeanor. He'd expected fear, maybe even pleading. The old man's composure was throwing him off balance. What are you drinking there, Walter? Razor asked, reaching for Walter's glass. Whiskey, Walter replied, sliding the glass away from Razor's reach. And I prefer to drink alone. Razor's eyes narrowed. That's not very friendly. We're just trying to be social here. Dog, the younger biker, moved closer. Yeah, don't they teach manners in the old folks' home? Walter looked at Dog. Really looked at him, his blue eyes suddenly sharp and focused. Something in that gaze made Dog shift uncomfortably. I've never been in an old folks' home, Walter said quietly. Still live in the same house I bought in 1955. Truck laughed. Wow, 1955. Were dinosaurs still around then? The three bikers laughed, but their laughter had an edge to it now. They'd expected the old man to cower or leave. His continued calm was becoming irritating. Razor reached across the table and deliberately knocked over Walter's whiskey glass. The amber liquid spread across the wooden surface, dripping onto Walter's pants. Oops, Razor said with a smirk. Looks like Grandpa had an accident. Several people in the tavern gasped. Tom took a step forward, but a subtle shake of Walter's head stopped him. Walter looked down at his wet pants, then back up at Razor. His face remained impassive, but something cold and hard flickered in his eyes, a look that didn't belong on a frail 90-year-old. You know, Walter said, his voice surprisingly steady. In my day, men showed respect to their elders. Razor leaned in closer. Well, this isn't your day anymore, old man. It's ours. Walter nodded slowly as if considering this. Maybe so, but here's something you should know. He leaned forward slightly. I've sat in places a lot worse than this little corner, and I've met men a lot tougher than you three put together. For a brief moment, Razor seemed taken aback by the steel in Walter's voice, but he quickly recovered, his face twisting into a sneer. Is that right? You think you're tough, old-timer? Let's see how tough you are when... That's enough. The new voice came from behind Razor. A man in his 60s had stood up from the bar. He was wearing a faded blue cap with a military insignia. This doesn't concern you, Razor said without turning around. I think it does, the man replied, walking closer. When three young men harass a veteran in my presence, it very much concerns me. Razor turned, ready to confront this new interruption. How do you know he's a veteran? He's just some old guy. The man in the cap pointed to Walter's lapel where a small pin was attached. A pin only fellow veterans would immediately recognize. That's how I know, he said. Now why don't you boys find somewhere else to drink? Razor looked back at Walter, noticing the pin for the first time. But instead of backing down, he doubled down. So what if he served? Probably just peeled potatoes somewhere safe while real soldiers did the fighting. A dangerous silence fell over the tavern. Walter's face remained calm, but his eyes had turned to ice. Slowly, deliberately, he reached for his tin box and removed a single photograph, placing it face up on the table between them. The photo showed a much younger Walter, standing at attention while a general pinned a medal to his uniform. Even in the black and white image, the medal was unmistakable to anyone with military knowledge. Dog, who had been relatively quiet, leaned forward to look at the photo. His face changed as recognition dawned. Razor, he said quietly, I think we should go. Why? Razor demanded, not bothering to look at the photograph. Because of some old picture? Tom, the bartender, had moved closer now. That's not just any medal, he said. And he's not just any veteran. Razor grabbed the photograph from the table, his fingers leaving smudges on the worn edges. His eyes narrowed as he studied the image, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The younger biker, Dog, stood frozen, his gaze shifting between the photograph and Walter's weathered face. What's the big deal? Razor said, tossing the photo back onto the table. So he got some medal, probably for showing up. Dog cleared his throat. That's not just some medal, man. His voice had lost its mocking edge. That's a medal of honor. A murmur spread through the tavern. Several patrons leaned forward in their seats, trying to get a better look at the old man in the corner. Razor waved his hand dismissively. So what? That was 100 years ago. Look at him now. He gestured toward Walter, who sat calmly, his hands folded on the table. Can barely stand up straight. Tom, the bartender, stepped closer. Maybe you boys should know who you're talking to before you keep going. Walter held up his hand. It's all right, Tom, no need for that. His voice was quiet but carried across the now silent bar. He turned his steel blue eyes to Razor. Young man, you've spilled my drink and insulted me in front of these good people. I think it's time you moved along. Razor's face flushed red. Being dismissed by an old man, regardless of his past, wasn't something he was willing to accept, especially not in front of his crew. Or what, old-timer? What are you going to do about it? Razor leaned in closer, his breath hot against Walter's face. Walter didn't flinch. He'd stared down worse men in worse places. I'm not going to do anything. That's the difference between us. I don't need to prove myself to you or anyone else in this room. Truck, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up. What unit were you with? There was genuine curiosity in his voice. Walter glanced at him. 1st Marine Division, Korea. Later other places that weren't discussed at dinner tables. The man in the faded military cap who had stood up earlier now approached the table. Sir, if you don't mind me asking, are you Walter Jenkins of the Chosen Few? Walter gave a slight nod, discomfort flickering across his face. He'd never sought recognition for what he'd done. Never wanted it. The who? Razor asked, looking between them. The Chosen Few, the man explained, his voice filled with respect. The survivors of the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir, one of the bloodiest battles of the Korean War. Dog had pulled out his phone and was typing quickly. His eyes widened as he read whatever had appeared on his screen. Holy shit, he whispered. Razor, refusing to be cowed, grabbed the phone from Dog's hand. What are you doing? Looking him up, Dog said. Walter Jenkins, Medal of Honor, Korea. Razor scanned the screen, his expression gradually changing as he scrolled. The cocky sneer began to fade, replaced by something that looked almost like uncertainty. It says here, Dog continued, taking his phone back, that Sergeant Walter Jenkins saved his entire platoon when they were surrounded by enemy forces. It says, he paused, looking up at Walter with new eyes. It says you carried 3 wounded men through a blizzard behind enemy lines. For 2 days straight. Walter looked down at his whiskey-stained pants. That's not entirely accurate, he said softly. It was 4 men and it was closer to 3 days. A heavy silence fell over the tavern. Even the baseball game seemed to have gone quiet, though it still played on the screen above the bar. Truck, the heavy-set biker, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. My grandfather fought in Korea, he said. Never talked about it much. Said it was too cold to even speak most days, Walter nodded. Your grandfather was right about that. Razor stood up suddenly, his chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. His face was a mixture of emotions, anger, embarrassment, and something that might have been shame. We're leaving, he announced to his friends. This place is dead anyway. Dog hesitated, looking at Walter. Sir, I'm sorry about... Let's go, Razor barked, already heading for the door. Dog gave Walter an apologetic nod before following Razor. Truck stayed seated for a moment longer. My grandfather, he said quietly. He always said the real heroes never came home. But I think maybe the real heroes just never talked about it. He stood up, awkwardly extending his hand to Walter. Thank you for your service, sir. Walter shook the offered hand. Your grandfather sounds like a wise man. Truck nodded and turned to follow his friends who were waiting impatiently by the door. As the 3 bikers left, the door swinging shut behind them, the tension in the tavern began to dissolve. Conversation slowly resumed, though many eyes still drifted toward Walter's corner. Tom approached with a clean cloth and a fresh whiskey. On the house, he insisted, placing the drink in front of Walter. And this time I won't take no for an answer. Walter smiled slightly. Just this once, then. As Tom cleaned up the spilled drink, the man in the military cap approached again. Mind if I join you, Sergeant Jenkins? Walter gestured to the recently vacated chair. It's just Walter these days. And you are? Frank Dobson, Army, Vietnam. Frank sat down, his movements betraying old injuries. I've read about what you did at Chosin. Never thought I'd get to meet you in person. Walter took a small sip of his fresh whiskey. It was a long time ago. Some things, Frank said, don't fade with time. Walter nodded, understanding all too well what the other veteran meant. The memories that stayed sharp even as other parts of life blurred. The faces you never forgot. From across the room, a young woman approached their table. She couldn't have been more than 30, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. "Excuse me," she said. "I don't mean to interrupt, but my grandfather was at Chosun too." Walter looked up at her. "What was his name?" "Robert Sullivan. Everyone called him Bobby." Walter's eyes widened slightly. "Bobby Sullivan? Radio operator? Always carried those peppermint candies?" The young woman's face lit up. "That's him. He passed away last year, but he told us stories about a sergeant who saved his life in Korea. Was that you?" Walter's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his tin box. He opened it and carefully sorted through the photographs until he found what he was looking for. He handed the photo to the young woman. "Third from the left," Walter said. "That's Bobby." She stared at the photograph, her fingers tracing the outline of her grandfather's young face. Tears welled in her eyes. "He always said he owed his life to his sergeant, that none of them would have made it home without you." Walter shook his head. "We all got each other home." "That's what we did." The young woman wiped away a tear. Would it be okay if I sat with you for a while? I'd love to hear about my grandfather, about what he was like back then." Walter nodded, gesturing to another empty chair. As she sat down, others in the tavern began to drift over. An older couple, the husband wearing a Vietnam veteran cap similar to Frank's, a middle-aged man whose father had served in the Marines, a young bartender who was shipping out with the Army in 2 weeks. One by one, they gathered around Walter's corner table, drawn by the quiet dignity of the old warrior and the stories he carried. Outside in the parking lot, the 3 bikers stood by their motorcycles. Razor kicked at the gravel, his face still flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Let's just go," he muttered. "Whole night's ruined anyway." Dog was still scrolling on his phone. "Did you know he went back for Special Forces after Korea? Says here he was part of some classified operations. There's almost nothing about it in the public record." "Who cares?" Razor snapped. Truck leaned against his bike, unusually thoughtful. "My granddad would have kicked my ass if he'd seen how we treated that old man." "Your granddad isn't here," Razor said, but there was less conviction in his voice now. "Yeah. Well," Truck replied, "I'm still alive, and I've got to live with myself." He looked back at the tavern door. "I'm going back in." "What?" Razor's head snapped up. "What for?" "To apologize properly," Truck said. "To buy the man a drink. To listen to whatever stories he's willing to tell. You can come or not, I don't care." Dog pocketed his phone. "I'm with Truck on this one." Razor looked between his 2 friends, disbelief on his face. "Are you serious? You want to go sit with some ancient has-been and listen to war stories all night? That has-been did more before he was 25 than you've done your whole life," Dog said quietly. "Than any of us have." Razor opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. He looked back at the tavern, where through the window he could see a small crowd gathering around Walter's table. "Fine," he finally said, "but I'm not apologizing." "Yes, you are," Truck said firmly. "And you're buying his next drink." Inside, Walter had pulled out more photographs. His hands, gnarled with age but still strong, pointed out faces and places, bringing the black and white images to life with his words. For the first time in years, he spoke openly about Korea, about the cold that went beyond physical sensation, about the bonds formed in the most desperate of circumstances. "We were just kids," he was saying as the tavern door opened again. "Most of us had never even seen snow before, let alone fought in it." The tavern door swung open and heads turned as the 3 bikers re-entered. Truck led the way, his large frame moving with surprising grace. Dog followed close behind, his eyes fixed on the floor. Razor came last, hanging back slightly, his jaw tight with reluctance. A hush fell over the gathered crowd. Walter looked up from his photographs, his expression unreadable. Tom the bartender tensed, ready to intervene if necessary. Truck approached the table, removing his leather gloves and tucking them into his belt. "Excuse me," he said, his voice softer than before. "We'd like to come back if that's all right." Walter studied the 3 men for a moment, then nodded toward some empty chairs nearby. "It's a free country," he said. "One of the things we fought for." The small crowd parted, making room for the bikers. Frank, the Vietnam veteran, gave them a wary look but slid his chair over. The young woman whose grandfather had known Walter watched them carefully. Truck sat down first, followed by Dog. Razor remained standing, his discomfort evident in his rigid posture. "I wanted to apologize," Truck said, looking directly at Walter. What we did earlier wasn't right. My grandfather raised me better than that. Walter waved his hand dismissively. No harm done. No, sir, Truck insisted. There was harm done. We disrespected you and your service, and I'm sorry for that. Dog nodded in agreement. Me too, sir. I'm really sorry. All eyes turned to Razor, who stood awkwardly at the edge of the group. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool air in the tavern. Finally, he cleared his throat. Look, he said gruffly. I was out of line. Shouldn't have knocked over your drink. He reached into his pocket and pulled out some crumpled bills. Let me buy you another one. Walter looked at the money, then at Razor's face. There was tension in the air, a collective holding of breath as everyone waited for Walter's response. Keep your money, Walter said finally. But you can join us if you want to hear some old war stories. The relief in the room was palpable. Tom patted Razor on the shoulder as he passed, heading back to the bar. First round's on the house, he called over his shoulder. Razor hesitated, then pocketed his money and pulled up a chair. The atmosphere gradually relaxed, conversations resuming in hushed tones as Walter returned to his story. As I was saying, he continued, we were just kids facing impossible odds. The Chinese had surrounded us at the chosen reservoir. Temperatures dropped to 40 below zero. Our weapons froze. Men lost fingers and toes to frostbite. He pointed to another photograph. This one showing a rugged mountain pass covered in snow. We had to fight our way out through a narrow road with the enemy holding the high ground on both sides. How many of you were there? Asked the young bartender who was soon joining the army. About 15,000 Marines and army troops, Walter replied. Against nearly 120,000 Chinese soldiers. Whispers spread through the group. Dog leaned forward, genuinely interested now. How did you get out? Walter's weathered face softened with a distant memory. One step at a time. That's all we could do. Keep moving. Keep fighting. We had a saying. Retreat, hell. We're just attacking in another direction. A few chuckles spread through the group. Even Razor's mouth twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile. The night it happened, Walter continued, when I earned this medal they gave me, we were cut off from the main column. Our lieutenant was dead, radio operator wounded. 23 of us trapped in a small valley with hundreds of enemy soldiers closing in. The tavern had gone completely silent. Even the baseball game seemed to have paused, though it was just a commercial break. 4 of our men couldn't walk. 2 with gunshot wounds, 1 with shrapnel in his leg, and 1 with severe frostbite. The rest of us were in hardly better shape. Walter took a sip of his whiskey. Someone suggested we leave the wounded behind with a few grenades so they could take care of themselves when the enemy got close. Several people gasped. The young woman with the ponytail covered her mouth with her hand. I didn't like that idea much, Walter said simply. Told the boys we were all going home or none of us were. So what did you do? Truck asked, completely engrossed in the story. Walter looked down at his hands, which despite their age still looked strong. We made stretchers from tree branches and our jackets, took turns carrying the wounded. We had to move at night, hide during the day. The snow was deep, the cold was. Well, there aren't really words for that kind of cold. He pulled out another photograph, this one showing a much younger Walter, his face gaunt and his eyes haunted, standing beside several other hollow-eyed young men. This was taken about a week after we made it back to our lines, he explained. We'd lost some weight by then. The men in the photo looked like walking skeletons, their uniforms hanging off their frames. We walked for 3 days, always staying off the main roads. Had to fight through 2 enemy patrols. By the last day, I was carrying 1 man on my back and dragging another on a makeshift sled. The other boys weren't in much better shape, but we kept going. How? Razor asked suddenly, speaking for the first time since his brief apology. How did you keep going? Walter looked at him, really looked at him, as if seeing past the tough exterior to something underneath. Because we'd made a promise to each other. Marines don't leave their own behind. Razor held Walter's gaze for a long moment, then looked away, something shifting in his expression. When we finally reached our lines, Walter continued, I don't remember much. They told me later I walked right up to the perimeter guards, reported our unit had returned, and then collapsed. Woke up 3 days later in a field hospital. And they gave you the Medal of Honor for that, Frank said. Frank. Walter shook his head. They gave me a piece of metal for doing what any of those boys would have done in my place. The real honor was serving with men like that. The young woman wiped away a tear. My grandfather said you saved his life. He said he would have died in that valley if not for you. Walter smiled gently. Bobby Sullivan saved his own life. He kept talking the whole way back, telling jokes, keeping our spirits up even with shrapnel in his leg. Said he couldn't die because he had a girl waiting for him back home. My grandmother, the young woman said, smiling through her tears. She was all he talked about, Walter confirmed. Helen, right? He showed me her picture at least 100 times during the war. Said she was the prettiest girl in Pennsylvania. She still is, the young woman said. They were married for 70 years before he passed. A comfortable silence fell over the group. Tom returned with fresh drinks for everyone, placing them carefully on the table. What happened after Korea? Dog asked. The article I found online said you went into Special Forces. Walter nodded slowly. For a while, those records are still classified, so I can't say much about it. The ghost, Frank said suddenly. Everyone turned to look at him. That's what they called you, wasn't it? I heard stories when I was in Vietnam about a Marine from Korea who later ran operations so secret even the brass didn't know about them. They called him the Ghost because he could get in and out of anywhere without being seen. Walter's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes, a hint of a past not easily discussed. Like I said, Walter replied quietly, a lot of those operations are still classified. But it was you, wasn't it? Frank pressed. You were the Ghost. Before Walter could answer, the tavern door opened again, and an older woman entered. She was small, but carried herself with dignity. Her silver hair neatly styled, her clothing simple but elegant. Her eyes scanned the room until they found Walter, and her face softened with affection and exasperation. Walter Jenkins, she called across the room. It's nearly 10 o'clock. You promised to be home by 9. Walter's entire demeanor changed. The battle-hardened veteran disappeared, replaced by a husband caught staying out past his curfew. Dorothy, he said, a hint of guilt in his voice. I lost track of time. Dorothy made her way through the crowd, nodding politely to the people gathered around her husband. I can see that, she said, but there was no real anger in her tone. You found yourself quite an audience tonight. Walter began gathering his photographs, carefully returning them to the tin box. Dorothy, these folks were just listening to some old stories. She replied, looking around at the rapt faces. The Korea stories or the classified ones you're not supposed to talk about? Just Korea, Walter assured her, though Frank raised an eyebrow skeptically. Dorothy noticed the 3 bikers among the group and paused, taking in their leather jackets and tattoos. Made some new friends, I see. Truck stood up, extending his hand. Ma'am, it's an honor to meet you. Your husband is quite a man. I've known that for 68 years, she replied, shaking his hand. Though sometimes he needs reminding to take his heart medication and come home at a reasonable hour. The crowd watched with amusement as Walter stood up, straightening his shirt with the careful dignity of a man used to presenting himself well. Dorothy reached out and brushed some invisible lint from his shoulder, a gesture so intimate and familiar it spoke of decades together. I should get him home, Dorothy said to the group. He needs his rest. I'm fine, Dorothy, Walter protested mildly. These folks were just interested in some old war stories. Dorothy raised an eyebrow. The same stories you've refused to tell. Me for 60 years. Walter had the good grace to look slightly embarrassed. Different stories. A soft ripple of laughter spread through the group. The tension from earlier in the evening had completely dissolved, replaced by a warm camaraderie centered around the elderly couple. Mrs. Jenkins, Truck said, standing up again. Would you allow us to escort you and your husband home? It's dark out and we have our bikes. Dorothy looked up at the big man, studying his face. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her because she nodded. That's very kind of you, mister. Everyone calls me Truck, ma'am, he replied. And these are my friends, Dog and Razor. If Dorothy found the nickname strange, she didn't show it. "Well, Mr. Truck, we only live a few blocks away, but I would appreciate the company. Walter insists on walking, even at his age. The day I can't walk a few blocks is the day they can put me in the ground," Walter grumbled, but there was no real annoyance in his voice. As Walter and Dorothy prepared to leave, others in the group began saying their goodbyes. The young woman whose grandfather had known Walter hugged him tightly. "Thank you for telling me about him," she said. "It means more than you know." Walter patted her back awkwardly. "Bobby Sullivan was a good man. You come back sometime and I'll tell you more stories about him." Frank, the Vietnam veteran, shook Walter's hand firmly. "It was an honor, sir. A real honor." Outside, the night had grown cooler. Stars dotted the clear sky above, and a half moon cast silver light across the parking lot. Walter and Dorothy stood arm in arm while the three bikers prepared their motorcycles. "We'll walk alongside you," Truck explained. "Keep our bikes at walking speed." Walter nodded, clearly appreciating the gesture even if he might not have thought it necessary. As they began their slow procession down the quiet street, Dorothy looked over at Razor, who had been hanging back. "You're very quiet," she observed. Not what I expected from someone with a nickname like Razor. Razor seemed surprised that she had addressed him directly. "Just thinking, ma'am." "About what?" He hesitated, then glanced at Walter. "About how you never really know who someone is just by looking at them." Dorothy smiled. "I've known Walter for nearly 70 years, and sometimes I still discover new things about him." She patted her husband's arm affectionately. "Like tonight, finding him surrounded by bikers and war veterans telling stories he won't even tell me. Some memories are harder to share with those we love," Walter said quietly. "Don't want to bring the darkness home." Dorothy's expression softened. "I know, dear." They walked in companionable silence for a block. The rumble of the motorcycle's engines, kept at a low idle, provided a gentle backdrop to the night sounds of the small town. "If you don't mind me asking." "Sir?" Dog said, breaking the silence. "What did you do after the military? After all those classified operations and everything?" Walter chuckled. "Nothing nearly as exciting. I came back home, married Dorothy, and taught high school history for 30 years. Dog's eyes widened. "History, really?" "Best history teacher this town ever had," Dorothy said proudly. Students would come to the house years after they graduated just to talk with him. "Did they know?" Truck asked. "About what you did in the war?" Walter shook his head. "Most didn't. I was just Mr. Jenkins to them, the tough old history teacher who didn't accept late assignments." "He kept his Medal of Honor in a drawer," Dorothy added. "Wouldn't even display it in the house. It's just a piece of metal," Walter said. "Doesn't mean anything compared to the men who didn't come home." They turned onto a quiet residential street lined with modest but well-kept homes. Large oak trees created a canopy overhead, their leaves rustling gently in the night breeze. "Do you ever think about them?" Razor asked suddenly. "The ones who didn't make it back?" Walter was quiet for a long moment. "Every day," he finally replied. "You don't forget the faces. You don't forget the names." Razor nodded as if this confirmed something he'd been thinking. "My older brother was in Afghanistan," he said. "He didn't come back." The simple statement hung in the night air. No one spoke for several steps. "I'm sorry," Walter said. "What was his name?" "David," Razor replied. But everyone called him Slice. I was Razor, he was Slice. Stupid nicknames from when we were kids. "Nothing stupid about it," Walter said. "Nicknames matter. Shows you belonged somewhere, with people who knew you well enough to call you something different." They stopped in front of a small, white house with a neatly trimmed lawn and a large American flag hanging beside the door. A ramp had been added to the side of the porch steps, though it looked like it hadn't seen much use. "This is us," Dorothy said. Walter turned to face the three bikers. In the moonlight, his age seemed to fall away for a moment, and it was easier to imagine the young Marine who had carried his wounded comrades through enemy territory. "Thank you for the escort home," he said formally, extending his hand to each of them in turn. When he reached Razor, the younger man hesitated, then took Walter's hand in both of his. "Thank you for what you did," Razor said, his voice rough with emotion. "For your service and for telling us about it." Walter held Razor's gaze. "You're thinking about your brother." Razor nodded, unable to speak. "The best thing you can do for him," Walter said gently, "is to live a life worthy of his sacrifice. That's what they would all want for us." Razor swallowed hard, blinking rapidly. He nodded again and stepped back. You boys are welcome to come by any time, Dorothy said. Walter doesn't get many visitors these days. Besides his old students. I get plenty of visitors. Walter objected mildly. The mailman doesn't count. Dear, Dorothy replied with a smile. Truck laughed. We'd be honored to visit, ma'am. Maybe next time we could hear some of your stories. Dorothy's eyes twinkled. Oh, I have plenty of those. 68 years with this stubborn man has given me enough material for several books. As Walter and Dorothy turned to go inside, Dog suddenly stepped forward. Sir, I have one more question if that's okay. Walter paused at the bottom of the porch steps. What's that, son? The ghost thing that the Vietnam vet mentioned. Was that really you? Were you actually some kind of secret operative? Walter's face remained impassive, but his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners. Now that would be quite a story, wouldn't it? Walter, Dorothy chided gently. Stop teasing the boy, Walter sighed. There were operations after Korea, some in places where Americans weren't supposed to be. I did what I was asked to do for my country. That's all I can say about it. Dog nodded, clearly wanting to ask more but respecting the boundary. Come by on Sunday afternoon, Dorothy suggested. I always make too much pot roast and Walter could use the company. The three bikers exchanged glances, then Truck spoke for the group. We'll be here, ma'am. What time? 4 o'clock, she replied. Don't be late. Walter's very particular about punctuality. With final goodbyes, Walter and Dorothy made their way up to their porch. The three bikers watched as Walter held the door for his wife, his movements slow but deliberate, maintaining the courtesy of a lifetime together. As the door closed behind the elderly couple, Truck, Dog, and Razor stood in silence for a moment, each lost in his own thoughts. Well, Razor finally said, that's not how I expected this night to go. Me neither, Dog agreed. But I'm glad it did. They walked back to their motorcycles, parked at the curb. The neighborhood was quiet, most windows dark at this late hour. You know what's weird? Truck said as he straddled his bike. When we first saw him at the bar, I thought he was just some fragile old man. But after hearing his stories, I keep seeing him differently. Like you can almost see the Marine he used to be, Dog said, nodding. No, Truck corrected. Not used to be, he still is that man. Just in an older body now. Razor looked back at the Jenkins house where a light had just come on in what was probably the kitchen. Do you think we should really come back on Sunday? Absolutely, Truck said without hesitation. I wouldn't miss it for anything. Me neither, Dog agreed. Besides, I want to hear more about those classified operations. You heard him, Razor said. He can't talk about that stuff, Dog grinned. Maybe not, but Mrs. Jenkins might know more than she lets on. 68 years of marriage? She's got stories. As they started their bikes, the engines rumbling to life in the quiet neighborhood, Razor looked thoughtful. My brother would have liked him, he said, just loud enough to be heard over the engines. Would have liked both of them. Truck reached over and clasped Razor's shoulder briefly. No words were needed. As they pulled away from the curb, they drove slowly and quietly out of respect for the sleeping neighborhood. At the corner, just before turning back toward the main road, Razor looked back one last time at the small white house with the American flag. In the kitchen window, he could see two silhouettes moving about. An old warrior and his lifelong companion, going about their evening routine as they had for decades. Something about that simple image stayed with him long after they had ridden away into the night. Sunday afternoon arrived with golden sunshine and a gentle breeze that carried the first hints of fall. The street in front of Walter and Dorothy's white house was quiet, with only the occasional car passing by. At precisely 5 minutes to 4, the rumble of motorcycles broke the peaceful silence. Truck, Dog, and Razor pulled up to the curb, their bikes gleaming in the afternoon sun. They had spent the morning washing and polishing their motorcycles, though none of them would admit to the others how much effort they'd put into their appearance for a dinner with an elderly couple. They weren't alone. Each bike carried a passenger. Truck's girlfriend Linda, a nurse with kind eyes and a ready smile. Dog's cousin Pete, who had served 2 tours in Iraq. And most surprisingly, Razor's mother, a small, silver-haired woman who had insisted on coming once she heard about Walter. You sure this is okay? Razor asked as he helped his mother off the back of his motorcycle. We didn't tell them we were bringing anyone else. Dorothy Jenkins will have made enough food to feed a platoon, his mother assured him. Military wives always do. They approached the front door together, an unusual group. 3 bikers in their leather jackets, now free of the more offensive patches, accompanied by a nurse, a veteran, and a woman who looked like she belonged in a church choir rather than on the back of a motorcycle. Dog carried a bouquet of flowers. Truck held a bottle of good whiskey, and Razor's mother had brought a homemade apple pie, still warm from the oven. Before they could knock, the door swung open to reveal Dorothy, dressed in a simple blue dress with a pearl necklace. Her face lit up at the sight of the unexpected group. "Well, isn't this wonderful?" she exclaimed. "Walter, look who's here, and they've brought friends." Walter appeared behind his wife, looking more formal than he had at the bar in a pressed button-down shirt and khaki pants. His silver hair was neatly combed, and he'd clearly shaved with extra care. He smiled at the sight of the 3 bikers, then raised his eyebrows at their companions. "Hope it's okay that we brought a few people," Truck said, suddenly feeling like a schoolboy asking for permission. "The more the merrier," Dorothy replied warmly. "I always cook too much anyway. Walter can never finish the leftovers." They filed into the house, introducing themselves as they went. The interior of the Jenkins home was modest but immaculately kept, with comfortable furniture that had clearly been chosen for function rather than style. Photos lined the walls, Walter and Dorothy through the decades, children who must have been students, and here and there, groups of men in military uniform. What caught everyone's attention, however, was a small table in the corner of the living room. On it sat several framed photographs, a folded American flag in a triangle display case, and in the center, on a wooden stand, the Medal of Honor. "You took it out of the drawer," Dorothy said softly to her husband, noticing the direction of their gazes. Walter nodded. "Thought our guests might want to see it." Razor's mother approached the display, her hand covering her mouth. "It's an honor to be in your home, Mr. Jenkins," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "My late husband served in Vietnam and our son David in Afghanistan." Walter inclined his head respectfully. "Then it's my honor to welcome you, ma'am. The families served too in their own way." Dorothy clapped her hands lightly. "Let's move to the dining room. Everything's ready, and I won't have my pot roast getting cold while we stand around being formal." The dining room table had been extended to its full length and set with Dorothy's good china. Somehow she had managed to find enough matching chairs, though Walter later explained that he'd borrowed 2 from their neighbor that morning. As they settled around the table, with Walter at the head and Dorothy at the foot, there was an awkward moment of uncertainty. Then Walter bowed his head slightly, and everyone followed suit as he spoke a simple grace, thanking God for the food and the company. The meal that followed was everything Dorothy had promised. Pot roast so tender it fell apart at the touch of a fork, mashed potatoes whipped to creamy perfection, fresh vegetables from their garden, and rolls that filled the room with the scent of warm bread. The conversation flowed easily, moving from topic to topic. Dorothy told stories about Walter's years as a teacher, including the time he'd caught 2 boys skipping class and had made them write essays on the Battle of the Bulge as punishment. They both became history majors in college, she said proudly. One of them is a professor now. Pete, Dog's cousin, talked about his time in Iraq, finding in Walter a rare person who truly understood certain experiences that were difficult to put into words. Linda asked Dorothy about her recipes, jotting down notes on a small pad she pulled from her purse. As the meal progressed, Razor's mother turned to Walter. "I hope you don't mind me asking," she said, "but I've been curious since my son told me about meeting you. Did you ever feel angry? After the war, I mean. David, my older son, he came back from his first tour so changed. And before he went back for his second," her voice trailed off. The table grew quiet. Razor stared down at his plate, his jaw tight. Walter set down his fork, considering the question carefully. "Yes," he finally said. "I was angry for a long time. Not at the enemy, they were just young men following orders, same as us. I was angry at the waste of it all. The good men who didn't come home, the years lost." He looked across the table at Razor. "I was about your age when I finally figured out that the anger wasn't helping me honor their memory. It was just stopping me from living the life they never got to have." Dorothy reached over and placed her hand on Walter's. "Tell them about Joe," she said gently. Walter nodded. "My best friend in Korea was a guy named Joe Bryant, farm boy from Idaho, always talking about the orchard he was going to plant when he got home." A faint smile crossed Walter's face at the memory. "Joe didn't make it back. Died in my arms during that mission I told you about," He paused, taking a sip of water. For years after, I couldn't even look at an apple without thinking of him, without feeling that anger rise up. Then one spring, Dorothy and I bought this house, and I found myself planting apple trees in the backyard. 6 of them, different varieties. "The pie you brought," Dorothy said, looking at Razor's mother. "The apples came from those trees." "Joe never got to plant his orchard," Walter continued. "But every year when those trees bear fruit, I think of him. And it's not with anger anymore. It's with gratitude that I knew him, even for a short time." Razor's mother wiped away a tear. "Thank you for sharing that," she said. "I think that might help my son, too." Razor looked up, meeting Walter's eyes across the table. Something passed between them, an understanding that went beyond words. After dinner, they moved to the backyard where the apple trees Walter had spoken about stood in a neat row, their branches heavy with ripening fruit. The evening light cast long shadows across the neatly trimmed grass. Dog helped Dorothy carry out coffee and the apple pie, while Linda and Pete collected the dishes. Razor found himself standing with Walter near the trees. "We're having a veterans event at the VFW hall next month," Razor said after a moment of comfortable silence. "Nothing fancy, just a gathering. Some of the younger vets, they don't connect with the older guys. Don't think they have anything in common." Walter nodded, understanding what wasn't being said. "Would you come?" Razor asked. "And maybe say a few words? I think it would mean a lot, especially to some of the guys struggling with being back." Walter looked out across his yard at the people who had entered his life so unexpectedly. At Dorothy, laughing at something Truck had said. At Razor's mother, sharing a story with Linda. At the strange but perfect gathering of different generations. "I'd be honored," he said simply. Over the following weeks, a remarkable transformation took place. The road demons, once known for their rowdy behavior, became regular visitors at the Jenkins home. They helped Walter with yard work he could no longer easily do himself, fixed a leak in the roof, and even escorted Dorothy to her doctor's appointments when Walter wasn't feeling well enough. The veterans event at the VFW hall was just the beginning. Walter, with Dorothy always by his side, began speaking at schools, sharing his experiences not to glorify war but to help young people understand the true meaning of courage and sacrifice. And every Tuesday evening at Mac's Tavern, a reserved sign appeared on the corner table. There, surrounded by an ever-growing group of friends, Walter Jenkins would open his tin box of photographs and share the stories that had remained locked away for too many years. The unlikely friendship between the 90-year-old veteran and the bikers, who had once harassed him, became something of a legend in the small town. It served as a powerful reminder that beneath the surface of every person, whether a rough-looking biker or a frail elderly man, there are stories waiting to be told, connections waiting to be made, and healing waiting to happen. And when Walter's health began to fail the following winter, it was Razor who sat with him through the long nights, listening to stories of Korea, of classified missions, of a long life well lived. It was Truck who built a ramp for Walter's wheelchair, and Dog who drove 200 miles to bring back a special medication not available locally. They had entered Walter's life as strangers and antagonists. They left it as the sons he had never had, carrying forward the legacy of a man who had taught them that true strength isn't measured by intimidation or force, but by the courage to connect with others across the divisions of age, experience, and first impressions.